be more than human.
Back to the channel. My name is Joseph Carroll. I write under the pen name J.R. Carroll. And today we are finally back in Dresden. Now, it feels like I've been gone from Dresden for a long time. Maybe it's only been a week or two since I did the changes video. But, with the holidays and everybody's busy and been reading some other things here recently, but we are finally at Ghost Story. um, and coming off of changes and where we left Harry, um, dead in the water. You know Basically it was one of the most heart-wrenching things. You're just like, oh my god. Now, I came into Dresden, I want to say right at Cold Days, so I had known about Ghost Story. um, but again, with Jim and the names of these things, you never know. I thought, well, maybe Dresden's just gonna fight a bunch of ghosts, which he does. uh, but I didn't expect him to die, which is exactly where we start off with, as Dresden is going down the tunnel, right? But then it turns out that is, he actually ends up in the in between, is what they call it, and he runs into Carmichael, which you're like, man, we're going way back, right? Because Carmichael was back in book two. I think he was killed by the Loot Guru trying to save Lieutenant, Karen Murphy. Which is another thing that we kind of run into as he takes them into like this, the police officer or whatever, in the in between. And the one running the show there is actually Karen's father. And, he basically tells Dresden, he goes, well, our job here is to make sure everything is kind of balanced out. And the bad guys cheated. And we're like, the bad guys cheated? What are you talking about? And that was kind of one of the things that was looming over the book. And he kind of tells Dresden, he goes, three of your, friends or, family are going to be hurt if you don't go back and solve your murder. And, Harry's like, well, I mean, do I have to? And he's like, well, if you go, just know that if you die out there, it's for keeps. And of course, Harry being Harry, he's like, let's go do this. So that is where we start off. And so, of course, if you're a ghost, if you were Harry, where are you going to go when you're coming back? You're going to go to your friendly neighborhood ectomancer, Mortimer Lindquist. And he goes to Mortimer's house, and right off the bat, it's under siege. And we have lemurs and wraiths and this thing called the Grey Ghost, is out there attacking the house. And one of Mortimer's ancestors is actually, his name is Sir Stewart, like a giant guy from the Revolutionary War, and he helps fight them off. And um, you know and Harry kind of talks to him like, I need to get in there, and he kind of figures it out. And the guy's like, all right, you seem like a good guy. So he takes him into the house, and Morty's like, damn it, Dresden, I can't get away from you even in death. Stay away from me. I am not a hero. Um, but again, Harry wears him down, and then ends up saying like, I need you to take me to see Karen Murphy. And because Karen can help me figure this whole shebang out. Let me get a drink here real quick. Mm, yes. So I actually am the best dad ever. This is from my son for Christmas. Ooh, and I want to show you guys. I love that my wife feeds into my nerdiness, and probably my favorite, Christmas gift was a replica of the Blue Beetle. Yes, be jealous. This is awesome. So I'm building up my collection of Dresden memorabilia. But let's get back into the review here. So we find ourselves over at Karen's house, and kind of as Harry is on the outside of the house, kind of looking in, he's listening in, and everybody's in there, and they're talking about the rag lady, right? Who's this rag lady? And it turns out the rag lady is Molly, and Molly has been you know uh, filling in to Dresden's shoes. And this is a cool thing that we kind of figure out because we're just always in the first person with Harry, and we don't realize what actually he meant to everything. Um, and so we know about the vacuum that he created when he killed the Red Court down in South America. Just every a power vacuum. Everyone's trying to take over the territories. But what we learn here is that so many creatures and things would, as they're making their way out west or making their way out east, would just completely stay away from Chicago because of what we learned, that the bad guys called Dresden the Mad Wizard of Chicago, which I thought was really cool. And now Molly is trying to step up and become kind of that legend of Chicago, because it's taking her, Karen, and Marcone to kind of keep Chicago from being overrun by this new evil force called the Fomor. And we learn that they were banished by the She and the Sealy years and years and years ago, and they were dumped into the sea or whatever, or into Lake Michigan, or what have you. But what Molly has been doing is either killing people, or people have been dying, and she's leaving little scraps of Dresden's cloak or Dresden's duster or something on all these bodies, and trying to create another thing for these creatures and monsters to be afraid of. But through Mort, Harry ends up getting into the house, and one of the most heart-wrenching moments is when Harry, nobody can see him except for, of course, Mort, and Mister comes running into the living room and slams into Dresden's shin, which of course just looks like Mister is hitting thin air, and everyone realizes, oh my God, it is, Harry is here. And then when Molly arrives, everybody's afraid of her because she's been acting crazy, not showering, sleeping in the streets, and everything. And she shows up, and they're like, hey, we need you to check and see if this really is Dresden. And of course everybody leaves. She opens her sight and sees Harry, and kind of has a little mini breakdown, and he's like, hey kid, it's okay, blah 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 blah, and you're just like, oh my God, that's rough. And then as everybody is kind of Harry's explaining what he's trying to do here, the house gets shot up. And this is kind of a part where a lot of people didn't like this book, or they didn't like this part of the book. And one thing I've always said is, Ghost Story to me is one of the most well-written books. And I've read about 60 books this year, 60 fantasy books this year. And if you are mainly a Dresden reader and you haven't branched out a lot of people will call Dresden books palate cleansers. But let me tell you this, um, I've been spoiled with how good a writer Jim Butcher is, because getting into all these other series. Now I'm not going to say he's the end all be all, but he is better than 90+% of fantasy authors when it comes to writing. Nobody makes you feel for characters quite like Jim Butcher does, and and again, that's something I appreciated going through this time, is how well the writing is. Um, but there is a tangent here with these kids that shot up the house, that they're in like this cult where this low level sorcerer, and there's a whole side quest story with that a lot of people just felt like was only there to keep the pacing up in between this kind of character study of Dresden. Um, but the one thing that section does do is allow Dresden to give us a reason for him to tell us his backstory with He Who Walks Behind. And we find out, you know, what happened that night, you know, before he ends up with the Leonchi and then goes back and, kills Justin Dumore. So that was really cool. Being, what, 13 books in or whatnot, is just outstanding that Jim had the forethought to leave things for us to still get backstory on this far in. Was just amazing. And then, so from here, Mortimer ends up getting kidnapped by the Gray Ghost. And, he, calls in, Karen and everybody's like, hey, we got to go save him. Because we figured out while Harry was keeping away all of the, creatures and monsters from Chicago, Mortimer was actually, keeping down all the murderous, spirits and ghosts, keeping them in check. So, Mortimer ends up being more important than we ever knew he could actually be. And, it turns out that the Gray Ghost is actually the Corpse Taker, the Corpse Taker's ghost. And the Corpse Taker is just a great adversary for Harry. We end up seeing her, like, she's like dipping Mort into this kind of like a pit of wraiths, and they're raking at him, trying to drive him insane. And through all this, Dresden ends up using kind of like a back door through, through the, Never Never, to kind of sneak in to the Corpse Taker's lair, what have you, and we end up finding out that that part of Bob that he cut off that was from Kemmler actually didn't just go away. It ended up finding its way to the Corpse Taker. So we have Evil Bob. And when Dresden arrives in that little section of the Never Never, it's like made up like World War II, and they're on the beach and shooting down, and so he's storming the beaches of Normandy to make his way in, into her lair. But Good Bob ends up showing up and taking Evil Bob on, and allowing Dresden to make his way, to the other side. Now, when Dresden, ends up, fighting the Corpse Taker, he's using up all this power. He's finally learning how to use his magic and everything as a ghost. But then he realizes that he's actually losing himself, because he's using memories. Is what he learned from Sue Stewart, is to use memories as ammunition, and that's all ghosts are, right? It's just memories. And he's almost completely gone. And in his last little glimpse of power, he realizes he has to get Mort out of that pit, and wills himself, because through the whole book they were saying, oh, only ghosts that manifest themselves are crazy, and of course, Harry's done a lot of crazy shit, right? So he ends up using the last scraps of his magic, and he like audibly says "be," and he grows himself a body, and actually is able, fights off this person that's actually trying to kill Mort, and gets Mort free, and then goes after the corpse taker. But the corpse taker actually gets him this time. Sneaks up on him in Butters' body. She had already snatched up Butters, shoots Harry, and then you know, Harry turns back into a ghost who's has almost nothing. And then out of nowhere, here comes Molly, snatches up Butters and soul gazes him, and ends up doing a mind battle with the corpse taker, which Harry actually just able to sneak in, and actually he ends up in her mind too. And he's like, the grasshopper, he says grasshopper's gonna get killed. She's not gonna be able to stand up to the corpse taker. And it is really cool visuals that we get to see, explosions and everything. They talk about how him and her would practice, battling, and he ends up finding, she has a bunch of decoy headquarters. He finds the real one, and ends up, basically in her headquarters that looks like the Starship Enterprise from, on Star Trek, which I thought was pretty cool, pretty funny. They make some witty banter back and forth about you can't be a Star Trek fan and a Star Wars fan. But there ends up being a door. I think it's a door that she's like, oh, stay away from that door, Harry, and blah 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 blah. And so the corpse taker actually ends up finding her actual headquarters, and they starts trying to rip and destroy it. And Harry goes over to the door and ends up opening it. And this is where the big reveal happens. We figured out that, Harry actually hired Kincaid to kill him, and used Molly's mental magic to actually erase that memory. And I guess, he called Kincaid up and he's like, hey, Kincaid, you owe me a favor from saving Ivy on the island. And Kincaid's like, absolutely. Who do you want me to help you take out? And he's like, the New Winter Night. And Kincaid's like, I didn't know there was a New Winter Night. He goes, there's going to be. And of course, Kincaid puts two and two together real quick and says, so that's how it is? And Dresden's like, that's exactly how it is. And he's like, all right. He goes, I'm a man of my word. And so, Harry, knowing that Mab would figure out that he's lying to her, before he asked for help, he had Molly go back in and kind of erase that section of his memory. And, and my wife really hated that. Or really hated Harry for doing that, because it's like, okay, Harry, you get to die or whatever and kind of go off into the afterlife, but you're leaving Molly with that hurt, which was really, my wife really hates this book because of that ending, or that section of the ending. But inside of this, time slows down, and who does Harry meet up with but Uriel? And and this is where he gets, they go back and forth, and this is where he gets the nickname Mr. Sunshine. And he tells Harry, he's like, the bad guys cheated, and I'm here to balance the scales. And he was like, well, you really, you haven't balanced them yet. I mean, I found my killer and all this, but you really haven't done anything. And well, he's like, oh, maybe I have, maybe I haven't. You don't know. And then he shows that Dresden. He's like, I need to make sure before I go that everybody's okay. And we get to see that Mortimer ended up making his way up, and I guess it looked like there was a black swirling thing around Molly, which was the corpse taker, and Mort set all of these wraiths on her before she could get away and just completely destroyed her. So Harry got to see that Murphy was okay, that Holly was okay. And then he's like, well, show me my brother. And he gets to see his brother. And so Thomas, him and his woman, they figure out a way to be together. We'll just leave it at that. But so that kind of becomes a happily ever after for them, it seems. And then another heart-wrenching moment is we get to see where Dresden's daughter is, and she is with the Carpenters, and we get to see that in retirement, Michael has got at least I think 4 guardian angels. So I'm like, well, that's the safest place on earth then probably. And he goes in there, and we get to see Mouse pops up, and Mouse, of course, Mouse can see Dresden, and Dresden kind of tears up, and he's like, oh, my dog, and that hits you in the feels. And Dresden's like, well, how long can dogs live? And Uriel's like, he's like, foo dogs can live as long as they need to live, even living as long as a wizard if need be. And so Dresden feels good that she'll always have Mouse. And so then he decides, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go. And he goes, but you still haven't balanced the scales. And, and he's like, well, he goes, you never know. And then Harry wakes up, and Harry's in all kinds of, pain and everything, and he can barely open his eyes. And he's like, oh, what kind of hell am I in? And he looks up, and who does he see but Mab? And it turns out that Mab and Demon Reach were keeping Harry's body alive for 6 months. Harry had these vines that were like intravenous, putting fluids into his body. And Mab looks all gaunt and sucked in because she's using a lot of power to keep his body alive. And she's like, and Mab is like, mine. And then, Harry's all, kind of sees this depression. And he's like, she got me. I can't get away. All this was all for nothing. And then Uriel whispers in his ear and is basically like, it's a lie. She can't change who you are. And then that kind of, Harry starts laughing, and she's like, what are you laughing about? And he's like, you'll never be able to change who I am. And I am who you need. You could go in and mess with my head, but then I'll only do exactly what you need me to do, and that's it. I won't do anything more. I will not go above and beyond, and you'll have yourself a meteoric night. And he goes, but if you let me do what I need to do, I will be the greatest knight you've ever had, and I will raise your name up, but I will do it my way. And that is just one of the greatest lines ever. So thank you all for coming through and watching the whole video here, and I will catch you in the next one.